Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen Afrikaans video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 13 of my organisation series. In this case I'll be providing a view of the Russian World War II brigades, divisions and corps combat strengths and how they changed as the war progressed. I'll be using the point system from the Corps Commander set of rules. If you want more details about this, please view some of my earlier videos. For those who have viewed my earlier videos, the viewers need to understand that 100 points of tanks will operate very differently from 100 points of infantry. Thus, comparing tank battalions with infantry battalions need to be done through a subjective filter. However, comparing tanks with tanks and infantry with infantry is perfectly acceptable. As no point system can be 100% correct, what I've done is I've divided the Corps Commander points values by 250 to give us a value which is several orders of magnitude higher than the Corps Commander number, which means that if you see a 2, you absolutely know it's weaker than a 3. In this video I'm assuming Russia's involvement with World War II started with a conflict with Japan in the mid-1939 period. This was shortly followed by their invasion of Poland in later 1939. The final Russian involvement with conflict before the German invasion was their disastrous winter war with Finland. The Russians possessed a number of rifle brigades, which were small and light independent formations. They were reasonably effective considering their size. As you can see here, the brigade was simple, with the indirect forces consisting of only 2 mortar and 1 light gun battalions. It also possessed an anti-tank battalion. The infantry battalion was small by the Infantry Division standard of the time. The Russian Infantry Division of 1939 was organised along a Western principle, making it very large and very complex. Unfortunately, after the purges, the Russians lacked the officers or experienced men to manage this formation effectively. This was a large infantry division. The support battalions were, however, rather weak, but the infantry battalions were strong by even Western standards. In 1939, the Russians organised most of their tanks into light tank brigades or just simply tank brigades. The tank brigade consisted of 1 reconnaissance battalion, 1 motor infantry battalion and 1 tank battalion, with support from a mixed mortar battalion. It was a decent-sized combined arms brigade. Initially, the Russians placed their heavy tanks into special heavy tank brigades. By 1941, the new heavy tanks were not being organised in this manner, but the older ones were still in these heavy tank brigades. The heavy tank brigade was a single heavy tank battalion, which was reasonably strong, supported by a brigade support formation. It did not prove very successful in Finland. When the Russians fought the Japanese in Mongolia, the Russians did custom make their tank battalions or brigades under Zhukov's command, and the result was a reasonably good formation. Most of the changes from their standard organisation is really invisible at this level. However, the morale and experience was reasonably high, no doubt due to the fact that they were very far away from the source of Bolshevik purges. Also in the east, Zhukov formed Mechanized Brigades or motorised infantry brigades, which were used in conjunction with the tank brigades. They proved highly effective against the Japanese. The Mechanized Brigade was a motorised infantry regiment supported by an armoured car battalion and a mixed mortar battalion. In June 1941, Germany attacked Russia, which started an epic land conflict which lasted until May 1945. After the initial German advances in the north and centre, the Germans swung south and pocketed a huge Russian force around Kiev. The Rifle Brigade, being basically a fairly simple formation back in 1939, did not change very much in 1941. The only noticeable change was a slight reduction in the brigade support formations. For the infantry divisions, while it's true some changes occurred after the disasters in Finland, the division was still far too large and far too complex, considering the lack of experienced officers and men available to man it. The changes that did occur were the light tank battalion was replaced with a reconnaissance battalion consisting of infantry and trucks, which proved far more effective. The infantry regimental support and infantry battalions were reduced in strength as well. After the German invasion and the huge losses, the Russians began to form emergency divisions or diminished divisions. The first emergency or diminished division form were little more than a horde of riflemen. The engineers, anti-tank howitzer battalions were removed, and the infantry battalions were little more than men with rifles. The light tank brigade or tank brigade also experienced some minor changes after the Finnish campaign. The change was rather reasonably minor. The motorised rifle battalion strength was reduced, but otherwise the brigade remained much the same. The heavy tank brigade proved less than useful in Finland, and most of the modern heavy tanks were merged into the new tank divisions. However, the old tank brigades were retained. Apart from some minor upgrades in the actual vehicles in the heavy tank battalion, the formation did not change. After the German invasion, the tank brigade experienced a major change, increasing in complexity as after the tank divisions were destroyed, these formations represented the main armoured formations of the Russian army. The tank brigade gained an anti-aircraft battalion, and the armour was organised into a regiment consisting of a light battalion of tanks and a medium battalion of tanks. After seeing the success of the Germans in France, the Russians quickly formed tank and mechanised divisions. In principle, these were reasonable formation, but once again, a lack of skilled officers and men, and the rapid changes resulted in a barely functioning division. The tank division consisted of one motorised infantry regiment, one medium tank regiment, and one light tank regiment. Supporting this was a motorised artillery regiment of 2 artillery battalions. The battalions were of average strength for the period. The mechanised divisions had 2 motorised regiments and 1 tank regiment in summary. After a short period of reorganisation, that is shifting the armour back from the south back up north, the Germans launched Operation Typhoon in October, which took them to the gates of Moscow. As with the infantry divisions, the German invasion resulted in a short-lived emergency rifle brigade. However, due to the initial simplicity of the Rifle Brigade, this did not really have a major impact on its structure. The only real difference was that these emergency brigades lacked a heavy mortar brigade, but otherwise was unchanged. By October, the diminished divisions were being beefed up. They were an emergency formation that was actually not very effective, but nonetheless critical at the time. The Russians began to relook at their divisions and started beefing them up. But once again, the biggest problem they had was they lacked experienced troops, and as a result, whatever changes resulted would need to be simple. The purges that the Bolsheviks initiated back in the 30s dramatically impacted the combat effectiveness of the Russian army. The anti-tank battalion was removed from the earlier diminished divisions. However, the engineer and anti-aircraft battalion were once again added back. A mortar battle battalion was also added. The infantry regiments gained a mixed mortar battalion. They were beginning to build up their divisions to something that would be substantially more functional. I'm not really going to be covering the cavalry divisions in any great detail, but for just completeness, I've added a cavalry division dated December 1941. The cavalry divisions were very simple, basically a cavalry battalion supported by some light guns and other support formations. They did prove somewhat useful in certain offensives because being non-motorised for the most part, they were able to cover terrain that motorised troops would find it quite difficult to cover, particularly in the central part of the front. The tank brigades continued to be beefed up. These were the only armoured formations in the Russian army, and the Russians needed to make them powerful and useful enough to be a counter to the German panzer divisions. The infantry battalion under brigade command was beefed up, and a motorised infantry regiment was added, making this very much like a mini division, and this is basically the way they functioned. The tank brigades went through an unusual stage starting with about December 1941. Due to very heavy losses, the number of tanks had dramatically dropped in these mini division type brigades. Yet, to ensure the brigade was ready when new tanks arrived, the brigades were not merged or disbanded. The result was there was a period where many of the tank brigades were unusually weak. This weakened formation, or cadre formation, was a very small formation. One weak motorised infantry battalion and a weak tank battalion. In December, the Russians got a large number of divisions from the Far East and were gaining experience, and other divisions were gaining experience and getting additional support formations added. So the constant evolution of the Rifle Division was basically something that occurred almost on a monthly basis. This shows the December Rifle Division. The Engineer Battalion was weakened to the point that they basically round down to zero in this case and thus disappear, but there are some engineers. The Anti-Aircraft Battalion and Recon Battalion was also removed. The Anti-Tank Battalion was added back. Clearly removing anti-tank capacities from these divisions proved not to be very successful. A Rocket Artillery Battalion was added, which increased its indirect fire capacity. Rocket artillery was a far simpler weapon than normal indirect fire weapons and was something that the Russians had sufficient troops to man. While there were some adjustments in the infantry regiments, the rest of the formation pretty much remained the same. In December 1941, the Russians launched their winter offensive, which did take significant amounts of ground and caused significant losses among the Germans. After the winter offensive ran out of steam, the Russians launched a short-term offensive in the spring or period, which was not very successful, and then the Germans launched their 1942 summer offensive. By the beginning of 1942, the infantry brigades had returned to their standard structure. The Russians did depend on these formations a great deal, as they were simple to raise and field. By 1943, they became less important as the divisions became more effective, and in 1944, many were disbanded to resolve manpower issues in the rifle divisions. The brigade regained its mortar battalion, which it earlier lost, and its support was beefed up. It was now more powerful than the pre-invasion brigade, no doubt due to the fact that these were fairly important formations in the Russian army at this point in time. After 7 months of extraordinarily dramatic changes, the infantry divisions had reached a type of stability. The Russians were still experimenting with removing and adding formations, and this divisional structure was certainly no different, but we're not seeing the massive changes that we saw earlier. The Anti-Aircraft Battalion was added back again. A machine gun battalion was also added. Otherwise, the division remained much the same. After the massive changes in the previous 6 months, this was about as stable as the Russians had ever seen. In March 1942, the Russians deployed their new divisional-sized armoured formations, the Tank Corps, basically a formation with 3 former independent brigades. The initial Tank Corps consisted of a motorised infantry brigade with 2 tank brigades. The battalion-level formations were all reasonably weak, and to a large extent, even though this was supposed to operate as a corps, it tended to sometimes break down and operate as individual brigades. In November 1942, the Russians launched Operation Uranus and Operation Saturn. The Russians did form airborne brigades. Actually, they had them before the war as well, and these did conduct airdrops during the Russian winter offensive. They achieved reasonable success, but did suffer very heavy losses. The airborne brigade was very small and lacked much in the way of heavy weapons. As to the infantry divisions, another round of major changes were implemented, reversing some of the earlier changes. The manpower problem was beginning to cause major issues. The anti-tank, rocket artillery and heavy mortar battalions were removed from the infantry division, but an extra light artillery battalion was added. The infantry regiments experienced a drop in combat strength, probably related to manpower. Clearly, the period of infantry division stability had ended. The initial Tank Corps had been destroyed in the summer, but lessons were learned and the new Tank Corps was organised for the Russian counter-offensive. The Tank Corps now gained an armoured car battalion under Corps command. The motorised infantry brigade support was beefed up, as was the motorised infantry battalions themselves. The tank battalions were divided into a light and medium battalion, with the medium battalion gaining combat strength due to better and more medium tanks in it. The Russians organised and deployed their first Mechanized Corps in September 1942. The Mechanized Corps were much larger than the Tank Corps, but were not specifically designed for exploiting a breakthrough. Their purpose was to follow the Tank Corps and then to form up a defensive line to counter any German counterattacks, or alternatively, if there was a strong point which needed to be overcome, then their indirect fire capacity would be brought to bear. Unlike the Tank Corps, the Mechanized Corps had significant corps-level support formations from engineers, anti-tank, recon, rocket artillery and anti-aircraft and artillery. There was one tank brigade which did differ slightly from their standard tank brigade. Most Western Lend-Lease tanks were placed in this formation due to their reliability. There were the Mechanized Brigades, which had a tank regiment added to it as well. This regiment was reasonably powerful. After the successes of the 1942 winter offensives, the Russians extended themselves too far and suffered when the Germans counterattacked between February 43 and May 43. The structure of the Infantry Division remained reasonably stable, but manpower was causing problems, resulting in a reduction of manpower in some of the formations. The strength of the machine gun battalion had reduced until it rounded down to 0, according to my divide by 250. The strength of the infantry regiment also dropped again, mainly again due to the reduction in manpower that was available for it. A new type of formation was formed, the Guards Infantry Divisions. The Guards Infantry Divisions were exempt from this reducing manpower issue, at least initially. The Guards Infantry Division Machine Gun Battalion retained its old strength, as did the infantry regiments. At this point, the Guards Infantry Divisions were basically the same as the older, early or late 1942 Standard Infantry Division. Manpower had basically not been reduced. The Tank Corps was constantly being changed around, and it experienced another adjustment with an increase in corps-level formations. This was the second time that the Russians had done something of this nature. The Armoured Car Battalion was beefed up and a Rocket Artillery Battalion was added under Corps Command. The Motorised Brigade was increased in strength. The Tank Brigades basically remained unchanged. After that change, the Russians did another change in January 1943. The Tank Corps got additional support formations. It was beginning to look more than just a collection of brigades and was beginning to look like a coherent divisional size formation. The biggest change during this period was the addition of significant additional formations that were directly under Corps control. The Corps level support was beefed up. The Armoured Car Battalion was replaced with a Motorcycle Battalion. A Mortar Regiment and a self-propelled anti-tank regiment was added. The Motorised Infantry Brigade was unchanged. The Tank Brigade gained strength due to better tanks and a high proportion of medium tanks as compared with light tanks. The Mechanised Corps was also changing and growing rapidly with additional formations added in January 1943. As with the Tank Corps, the main changes were the addition of new corps-level support formations. There was no actual changes to the existing Corps Support or Artillery Regiment, but a Mortar Regiment and an Assault Gun Regiment was added. The Tank and Mech Brigades remained unchanged. The changes that occurred in January were comparatively minor, and as February came around, the Russians were once again modifying the structure of the Mechanised Corps, although once again it was a comparatively minor change. It must be pointed out the different Mechanised Corps often used different organisational structures. That is, one may be upgraded to the latest and the others may still retain the old structure. So there was a lot of crossover in all these different TO&E versions. In terms of the formations which were not changed, there were no changes to the corps level support formations, the artillery regiments, the mortar regiments, the assault gun regiments, or the Mechanized Brigade. The change which did occur was the Tank Brigade support was beefed up, which was what occurred to the Tank Corps tank brigades as well. In June 1943, the Russians were defending against the expected German 1943 offensive, and while they did suffer significant losses, they managed to hold the Germans at bay and eventually force them back. Specifically, or especially for the Guards infantry divisions, the Russians began to add more complex and heavier weapons back into the divisions to compensate for the reducing manpower issue. This required higher levels of experience and training, but there was no alternative. The machine gun battalion was officially removed, but the artillery gained an additional battalion. Otherwise, the division remained much the same. By June 1943, the tank corps were highly experienced and formidable armoured forces. They still had issues defending against German counterattacks and did suffer significant losses as a result. In terms of changes, the tank corps experienced some minor changes at the corps level, with the composition of the anti-tank forces changing, but was otherwise much the same as prior. The Russians were still constantly adjusting the structure in order to optimise its eventual ability to fight the Germans. In terms of changes, the corps formations experienced some minor changes as indicated, but was otherwise unchanged. An assault gun battalion was added. The infantry brigades received some additional support formations. The tank brigades did not change at all. In May 1943, the Mechanised Corps did experience some minor changes, but generally remained much the same. I assume because the German Air Force was less of a threat and German infantry strong points more of a problem, the Corps lost an anti-aircraft battalion but gained an assault gun battalion. At the Corps HQ level, there were no major changes. However, a heavy assault gun battalion was added. The tank brigade received some additional support formations. The Mechanized Brigade lost its anti-aircraft battalion. After stopping and then defeating the German counteroffensive, or German offensive, the Russians launched their own 1943 summer offensive. The Russians did have available air landing brigades to assist in their 1943 offensive, but did not use them very much at the early stage. It was more at the later stage that they were used. In terms of structural changes, there were no change, particularly in terms of combat ability, although there may have been some changes in terms of training. I'm not going to be covering the artillery divisions in any particular detail, but I will mention them in a few spots. The Russians, in order to compensate for a lack of experienced troops, concentrated their medium and heavy artillery into artillery divisions. While these still lacked the flexibility of German or Western artillery, they were highly effective in pre-planned area fire. The standard artillery division consisted of 3 light artillery battalions, 3 light howitzer battalions, 3 medium howitzer battalions and 3 mortar regiments. It represented a significant amount of firepower which was normally used at the beginning of Russian offensives. The infantry divisions were generally stable, with only minor adjustments occurring at this point. Some improvement in weapons did occur, and there was the beginning of manpower reductions, or serious manpower reductions, being replaced with an increased number of automatic weapons and other heavier weapons. This was a common occurrence for most of the major powers later in the war. As they ran out of manpower, they needed to make up for it by giving those remaining men better weapons. The standard infantry division now possessed 3 full-strength artillery battalions rather than 1 being a reduced-strength battalion. The infantry regiments did gain some additional heavy weapons, but was otherwise unchanged from the previous org structure. The tank corps were also reasonably stable at this point. The big change occurring now was the increase in assault gun capacity, improved tanks and a reduction in anti-tank or towed anti-tank guns. This was due to the changes in how these corps were being used. In the past, they were fed into a breakthrough, after which they advanced until they met a German counterattack. Thus, the anti-tank guns were critical in this case. As the war progressed, the overcoming of enemy infantry strong points became more important than defending against German counterattacks, which were becoming less and less. The tank corps basically traded in their towed anti-tank guns for tank destroyers. It's possible some corps still did use anti-tank guns or had a mix. However, it may be a specific, this is probably a specific org change, as tanks destroyers would have been much more useful than anti-tank guns or towed anti-tank guns in a formation of this nature. The Mechanized Brigades remained unchanged. The engineer battalion was beefed up and the anti-tank battalions were replaced with tank destroyer battalions, with the assault gun battalion getting heavier vehicles. The tank brigades were also getting a high proportion of T-34 medium tanks as compared with light tanks, and their strength grew as a result. The early tank corps probably had about half of their tanks as light tanks. That was no longer the case. The Tank Corps experienced another org change in November 1943. The anti-aircraft gun numbers were reduced, but otherwise the Corps remains the same. I'm guessing German aircraft were less of an issue in late 1943. There were no real changes to the Corps level formations or the tank brigades. However, the only change which occurred was the motorised brigade lost its anti-aircraft battalion, which is interesting because the Mech Brigade of the Mechanized Division also lost its anti-aircraft battalion earlier than this. The Mechanised Corps were also evolving, or at least their roles. Originally they were designed to form a firm defence against German counterattacks, or alternatively to overcome strong points. Now they were being increasingly used to overcome German strong points once the breakthrough occurred, and defending against the counterattacks was certainly becoming less of an issue. As a result, assault gun numbers went up significantly. The Mech Corps traded in their anti-tank guns for yet more tank destroyers and assault guns. It should be noted, while the Su-76 could be used as an assault gun, they were normally used as tank destroyers or in some cases as indirect fire weapons. The Su-122 and Su-152s were very effective as assault guns and tank destroyers as well, if required. The Corps lost its light artillery regiment, but this was compensated by additional tank destroyers and assault gun battalions being added. The increased proportion of T-34 medium tanks versus the T-50, T-60 light tanks did boost the strength of the tank brigade. The Mechanized Brigade remained unchanged. From December 1943, the Russians launched a major offensive across the entire front line, starting with the north. While the offensive in the centre was not that successful, down south the main strength of the Russian army battled it out with Manstein, who performed well but could not stop the Russian juggernaut. By 1944 the infantry brigades were getting less important, and many were disbanded to allow their manpower to be directed to the more useful infantry divisions. For the infantry brigades which did remain, the 1944 Infantry Brigade gained a SMG battalion, but was otherwise unchanged. After a number of air landings which resulted in very heavy losses, the Russians had determined the brigades, that is the airborne brigades, needed more heavy weapons, a lesson which most nations were required to learn. The Paratrooper Brigade gained an anti-aircraft and anti-tank battalion. It's interesting to note, unlike many other formations, the Russians had basically determined the optimal structure for their artillery division and stayed with it. A lot of variation did occur based on the availability of artillery, however, so this standard structure probably was comparatively rare. As a result, there were no changes to the artillery division in 1944. The manpower issues which occurred in 43 were even greater in 44, and the manpower issues were beginning to affect the combat capacity of the division, infantry division. The Russians increased the number of SMGs, LMGs and other heavy weapons to ensure firepower remained the same, but this was not keeping up with manpower losses. As we can see here, the infantry regiment continued to lose combat strength, primarily to do with manpower issues. The tank corps were reasonably stable. There was minimal improvements here and there, but the main changes which occurred at this point was new equipment, which had an impact on combat capacity or strength. Apart from the motorcycle battalion, there was no changes to the corps support formations, mortar regiments, motorised brigades or tank brigades. The main change which occurred at this point was the motorcycle battalion was beefed up, mainly because of new equipment, and they were beginning to add tanks to it. The Mechanised Corps did experience some changes, or more changes in the tank corps. The main trend was the increase in size and power of the self-propelled gun battalions, such as the Su-76, Su-122 and Su-152 battalions. Other minor changes also occurred in the support formations of the brigades. Ignoring the reconnaissance for now, there were no changes to the corps formations, mortar battalions. The light tank destroyer, medium assault gun and heavy assault gun regiments were dramatically increased in size. The reconnaissance battalion was beefed up. The light tank battalions, the medium assault gun battalion and heavy assault gun battalion experienced a dramatic increase in strength, at least doubling in some cases, and in one case even more than doubling in terms of combat strength. There was a minor adjustment in the tank brigade support formation, while the mechanised brigade support formations experienced a significant increase in strength. In the summer of 1944, the Russians launched a major offensive which destroyed Army Group Center. This is probably their most significant offensive since the Stalingrad pocket. The disaster, at least for the Germans, in the centre was then followed by a renewed massive Soviet offensive in the south and the collapse of the Balkan defensive position. While generally exempt from manpower issues, by June 1944 the Guards infantry divisions were being impacted by the manpower shortage. It was so severe, even the elite formations were experiencing a reduction in manpower. To compensate for this reduction in manpower, additional support formations were added, but as with the standard infantry divisions, the overall strength of the division did drop nonetheless. While the Tank Corps was generally stable, additional adjustments did continue in January or June 1944. The Corps Reconnaissance Battalion was increased in size yet again with the additional tanks. As this corps was involved in more complex exploitation activities, reconnaissance was actually more important, and that was the main reason why the reconnaissance was beefed up. Other than this, there was no additional changes. The Motorcycle Battalion, or Reconnaissance Battalion, was beefed up again. This was caused by it being equipped with medium tanks and better armoured cars, as well as armoured personnel carriers with infantry in them. By August 1944, the Tank Corps was beginning to change into a formation not unlike a Western Armoured Division, with increased artillery being added to supplement the rocket artillery and mortars. One major issue with the Corps was a lack of indirect fire capability, and while this did not allow it to compete with the German Panzer Division, even after the changes in August, it allowed it to use indirect fire to overcome obstacles more and more, which was basically its main issue at this particular point. Other interesting changes were the Tank Corps were beginning to receive new weapons and vehicles in such number the combat strength of the battalion was being affected. This included improved heavy 152 mm armed assault guns and the T-34-85 medium tank in sufficient numbers to make a difference. In addition, an artillery regiment was added to the corps. The heavy assault gun battalion received improved armoured vehicles, which increased its combat strength. The corps received a light artillery regiment, increasing its indirect artillery strength. The tank battalions were finally receiving T-34-85 medium tanks in sufficient strength to affect its combat strength, which, as you can see here, did increase the combat strength of the tank battalions. The Mechanized Corps was also comparatively stable, but it also received new weapons which did have an impact on its combat strength. The Corps support formations, mortar regiments, assault gun regiments remained unchanged. Some minor changes occurred in the brigades. The Tank Brigade gained additional support formations as well as newer tanks being deployed. The Mechanized Brigade lost support formations, but the tank regiments were beefed up. This assumed the Corps was equipped with Russian tanks, of course. In reality, many mechanized corps used American tanks as these were more reliable. While a tank in a tank corps was not expected to last very long, this was not the case for the Mechanized Corps. Thus, reliability over distance was more important than actually having a bigger gun and better armour. And so we now move to 1945, the final year of the war, in which the Russians invaded Germany itself, driving to almost the gates of Berlin in this case. In April, the Russians launched their final offensive, finally capturing Berlin and meeting the Western Allies. The war in Europe was at an end. In January 1945, the Russians disbanded a number of brigades, or infantry brigades, and divisions in order to boost manpower in the remaining divisions. The one upside was an increase in experience, allowing the Russians to reintroduce light howitzer battalions and other more complex weapons. The Russian infantry divisions were once again beginning to look like its older, more complex Western structure. The anti-aircraft and machine gun battalions were once again added to the infantry divisions. The artillery were reorganised with a net increase of 1 battalion. A mortar regiment was also added. The infantry regiments remained the same, at least in terms of combat strength, although manpower dropped and weapon numbers had increased. The same changes occurred to the Guards infantry divisions, with these formations retaining their manpower levels more than the standard divisions, although they still did suffer a bit. The Guards Infantry Division also gained the same additional assets. The Standard Infantry Division gained. The AA and MG Battalion were added. The artillery was reorganised with a net increase of 1 battalion. A mortar regiment was added. This shows the final form of the tank corps, which was utilised in the 1945 offensive. An interesting point was the Russian commanders decided to not use the new T-44 medium tank and decided to retain the T-34-85 tank, which was the most common medium tank at the point. The reason was that they didn't want to retrain their crew, which makes sense, but it was an interesting observation. They basically saw no need to worry about having a better tank to meet the Germans. They had more than enough to achieve their objectives. As we've seen for a lot of the previous org structures, the structure remained the same, but improved weapons and vehicles were having an impact on the combat strength. The heavy and medium assault gun regiments received new vehicles as well as being beefed up, increasing their combat strengths. The tank battalions were receiving more improved T-34-85 medium tanks, also increasing their strength. This shows the final form of the Mechanised Corps, which was evolved in the 1945 offensive, and it was becoming a rather unusual divisional size formation, unmatched by any other nation. In many ways, as the tank corps were developing developing their requirements and their abilities, the Mechanised Corps' roles were reducing. However, this was not to affect it until after the war. Apart from the addition of a 76mm M42 battalion, there was no changes to the corps structure, but improved assault guns did increase the strength of the assault gun regiments. Some of the regiments were equipped with the IS-2 heavy tank as well. What we can see here is a second anti-tank battalion was added to corps support, which was equipped with the 76mm M42 gun, allowing them to also be used in the indirect fire role and assault gun role against entrenched infantry, which is what I assume they were mainly put there for. New assault guns and increased supporting formations increased the strength of the medium and heavy assault gun regiments. Now let's look at some of the key divisions and tank corps formations and how they changed over the period of the war. I'm certainly not going to cover every formation because then this video would become ludicrously long, but we'll just cover the basic, which is basically infantry divisions, tank corps, and basically that's it. Let's look at the battalions which made up the infantry division up to May 1942. If we look at the infantry battalions, they experienced a drop in strength right at the beginning, pre-war, but otherwise remained generally stable up to the period to May 1942. The divisional support and infantry regiment support within the division did fluctuate at points, but apart from this, the division itself remained reasonably stable. While the number of battalions changed dramatically within the infantry divisions, the actual battalion strengths remained surprisingly stable, if weak by Western standards. From July 42 to May 45, the infantry battalion strength dropped at the end of the war, primarily due to manpower issues. Once again, apart from the adding and removal of battalions, the actual battalion strength of the infantry division remained rather stable. One reason of the stability is the way I'm rounding, so let's go up one level. If we look at rifle regiments, we can see the impact of the changes more clearly. There is a steady decline in the strength of the Russian Rifle Infantry Regiment from its pre-war strength to its final strength at the end of the war. Let's now look at tank corps. Due to the size of the corps, we'll divide our analysis into corps support troops and then the tank and motorised brigades individually. It's obvious that support formations under the corps dramatically increased in numbers, but compared to the early formation period of the tank corps. In fact, the first tank corps effectively had no significant corps level support. For the second half of the war, the support formations continued to grow in both numbers and strength. This was the area the tank corps developed the most between its formation and at the end of the war. Let's look at the tank brigades, which did fundamentally represent the bulk of the power of the tank corps. From its formation, the tank brigades also grew in strength. The battalions themselves did not change much, but the brigade as a whole steadily grew in combat strength. This growth in strength continued in the second half of the war as well, although much of the increase in combat strength was caused by improved weapons. Let's now look at the motorised brigades. We can see here that in the first half of the war, they also steadily grew in strength, at least at the brigade level, if not at the individual battalion level. In the second half of the war, when the AA battalion was removed, the combat strength of the brigade did drop, but after this point the motorised brigades did not change until the end of the war, at least in terms of combat strength. The Russian army experienced the greatest change of any of the major nations due to it having the greatest challenge, but this tended to be at brigade or higher level. At battalion level, there was a surprising lack of change in terms of combat strength, if not actual structure. And so we come to an end of my part 13 of my video series on organisation, in this case analysing the Russian army in World War II, specifically the estimated combat strengths of the battalions which made up the brigades, divisions and corps. Alle guten Dingen, kommen zu einem Ende.